Hi, everybody. This is Dan from Another Bourbon Show. Today it's just going to be me because this is going to be a shorter episode. Just little things I'm calling bourbon basics. With the big boom in bourbon over the past 5, 6 years, there's a lot of people who are starting to drink bourbon who never drank it before. And I figured that it might be helpful to do little short videos instead of our longer episodes where it's 35, 45 minutes, mostly of us making fun of each other. I thought it might be helpful to just do short videos that are just informative. With this being the first one, I figured the single best place to start is actually in the distillation process. What is a distillate? What creates whiskey or bourbon? So that process is referred to as distillation. And it's the same process whether you're talking about vodka or tequila or gin, etc. Um, but we're going to talk about specifically the bourbon and whiskey side of things. So to create a distillate, it's the same process. You take a grain. For bourbon, it's going to be corn, of course, and then typically a combination of either wheat or rye and malted barley. Those are the four grains you typically find in a bourbon. You take those grains, you grind them up into a smaller powder form almost. You take that powdered, the ground grains, and you put them into a vat with water, and you add yeast. Now the yeast eats the sugars that exist in those grains. The byproduct of the yeast eating the grain is alcohol. And that once the yeast has eaten the sugars and has created alcohol, you now have a fermented product. So with beer, that's where the process stops. You strain the mash out of the liquid. You might age it for a little while to mellow it, to temper it, to add some flavors to it. Or wine is the same thing. That's a fermented product at that point. Distilling for bourbon or whiskey takes it another step further. At that point, for distilling bourbon or whiskey, you take that fermented product and you start to heat it. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water does. So the goal is to heat that fermented liquid hot enough that the alcohol starts to evaporate, but not hot enough that the water starts to evaporate. So what you're doing is you're trying to separate the alcohol from the water. When you reach that point and the alcohol starts to evaporate, it rises. It rises, and then typically there's different processes, but we're going to keep it simple. It rises, it goes up into something that where it begins to cool. That alcohol, as it begins to cool, it forms back up into a liquid. It drops down into a separate container. That process of separating the alcohol from the water is what distillation is. You typically are going to do that until you get as much of the alcohol out of that original fermented product as possible. In doing so, you're going to have a whole lot more water in that than you want. So then you'll typically take that distilled liquid and you'll do it again. You'll do it 2, maybe 3 times until now you've got a distillate that's in the vicinity of typically anywhere from 100 proof up to 130 proof, something like that. And that's at the point where a bourbon or a whiskey is then put into a barrel to be aged. If it's a tequila, that's where you've got your silver, and then you've got your different age statements based on however long they're going to age it. If it's a vodka, then they'll typically distill it 4 or 5 more times to get it as pure as they can get it. But with whiskey, you don't actually want it to be all that high of a proof because each time you distill it, you also lose some of the flavor of those grains that started off. And one of the things I like so much about bourbon and whiskey is that it does retain that flavor from the grain that started it off with, what be it corn or wheat, barley, or rye. So that's the distillation process. Basically ferment something, heat it up to separate the water from the alcohol, cool it down, age it, bottle it, and drink it. So that's the distillation process. I hope this was helpful for you. Again, this was as simple of a topic as you can start off with, but I think it's important. If this was helpful, great. If it wasn't, I apologize. I hope this wasn't a waste of your time.